One of the questions that I get very frequently is it possible to create Dolby Atmos with reverb? And the answer to that question is a resounding yes, it is, as long as you're on Windows or on a Mac. And this is what we're going to do today. We're going to go through the entire setup from the beginning to the end. We're going to use reverb, we're going to produce Dolby Atmos, and we're going to do that on the Windows machine. So if you're a reverb user and you're interested in Dolby Atmos, this one is going to be interesting. But first of all, hello everybody. In case you're new here, my name is Michael Wagner. I'm a digital media educator with more than 30 years of experience in higher education. And on this channel, I talk about digital media, game design, and spatial audio. Today about Dolby Atmos and reverb. If any of those topics interest you, I invite you to subscribe or join my Discord community. Invite link is in the description below, or you can also use the QR code here somewhere. Before I get started, a couple of disclaimers. First of all, reverb is not my main digital audio workstation. I do use reverb once in a while, but not on a daily basis. So if there are certain things that I do that could be done more efficiently or faster or with a certain keyboard shortcut, I apologize. This is not what I do on a daily basis. Second, some of the plugins that I'm going to use today I received for free, either in the form of evaluation licenses or as pre-release licenses. However, this is not a sponsored video, so everything that I'm going to say is strictly my own opinion. Nobody had any influence, and nobody's going to see this video before it's going to be released. And with that being said, let's get started. Now, the project that I'm going to use today is very similar to the project that I used last week. It is a group of samples that come from a sample pack from a developer who specializes on producing audio for game development or movie or television productions. And these are really nice. The developer is called Duende Sounds. I invite you to check them out. Once again, not a sponsored video. I actually purchased those samples myself, but they're really, really nice and really, really useful. So let's have a listen on what we have here. So in essence, what we have is we have a drum loop and then a drone. Then we have a synth, which is a little bit of a clocky sound, so kind of it sounds like a clock. And finally, some melodic content. Let's just let that loop around. And what we're going to do is we're going to turn that into an Atmos project. But before I do that, I'd like to spend a little bit of time explaining what exactly Dolby Atmos is, because not everybody who is watching this video might be aware, and many might wonder what is the whole deal about Dolby Atmos, why are we talking about Dolby Atmos, is this any useful? And the easiest way to think about Dolby Atmos is really as a hybrid audio format that combines a channel-based component, something that you would find in movie or television productions, for example, with object-based components, something that is very useful in game development, for example, so something that is a little bit more immersive. By combining those two, you essentially get the advantage of both. So on one hand, you have something that is really anchored in a channel-based environment, and at the same time you have the benefit of having 3D audio objects that you can move around in three-dimensional space and create very, very immersive experiences that way. Now, the main advantage of doing it that way is that the endpoint device that is playing the Dolby Atmos can now intelligently decide how to render that audio in a way that is optimal to that particular reproduction system. So if you have a 7.1 system, for example, or a 5.1 system, then the endpoint device, the actual consumer device, is capable of rendering the Dolby Atmos content in a way that optimizes that particular speaker setup. And it goes down to stereo, so you can also render it in a way that is optimal for stereo. And it gives you a lot of flexibility, and it also allows you to gracefully downgrade the content. So if you have something that is originally designed for a large speaker system, it gracefully downgrades to anything below that, including a stereo environment. Now you might wonder, isn't that just a fad that will go away? Now everybody's talking about Dolby Atmos, but maybe next year nobody kind of remembers what that even was. And that is very well possible. However, you need to be aware that when we're talking about immersive audio, and immersive audio is something that's really going to become more and more important as the individual immersive systems become more and more dominant, like virtual reality, games, other things like that. Dolby Atmos really functions in pretty much the same way every other immersive audio system functions. So whether it's Dolby Atmos or MPEG-H or something else, doesn't really matter. The overall strategies that you need to employ in order to develop content for these types of systems is pretty much the same. So learning how to work with Dolby Atmos can be really, really useful for the future, even if Dolby Atmos is not going to be around forever. And that's why I would recommend that everybody who's really interested in audio should actually get some sort of idea on how Dolby Atmos works and how to work with Dolby Atmos. And this is what we're going to do here. Now, if you want to produce Dolby Atmos content, there are really three approaches that you can take. The first one is you could go with a digital audio workstation that has a native Dolby Atmos workflow, something like Cubase, Nuendo, Logic, Pro Tools, or DaVinci Resolve Fairlight. So that's one option. However, if you want to stay with your current digital audio workstation, then that is probably not what you want to do. The other options are you can either use the traditional Dolby Atmos workflow that uses the Dolby Atmos renderer. That, however, is only available on the Mac operating system, so you can't really do that on Windows. And the third option, and that's the one we're going to use today, utilizes the Fiedler Audio Dolby Atmos Composer that came out a couple of weeks ago, and that has the main advantage that it functions on Windows exactly the same way it functions on a Mac. So everything that I'm going to show you today on Windows works exactly the same way on a Mac, and that makes it a really, really convenient way to get into Dolby Atmos. So let's turn that into a Dolby Atmos project. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to drop an instance of the Fiedler Audio Dolby Atmos Composer on our master track. And here we have it. So let's add that. Now, once we open that up, we essentially are greeted with the traditional Dolby Atmos interface that shows us the 128 channels. And as I said before, Dolby Atmos is really a hybrid format that combines a channel-based format with an object-based format. And you can actually see that with the colors here. So the first 10 channels are the channel-based component. So this is the so-called Dolby Atmos Bed, or in Fiedler speak, Fiedler also calls it the composite. We are not going to get too much into composites, just think of it as the Dolby Atmos Bed. And then the 118 remaining channels are for the objects. So you have a total of 118 objects that you can use. And together this makes the Dolby Atmos Masterfile. Now the Dolby Atmos Composer is available in two different versions. I'm going to leave a link to their webpage in the description below so you can check them out. One is the Essentials version, one is the full version. I am working with the full version here. However, be aware that everything that I'm going to do here works with the Essential version as well. So if you want to just get a foot into Dolby Atmos, you don't need to purchase the full version. The Essential version is perfectly fine. Okay, the next thing we need to do is we need to route the individual tracks into the Dolby Atmos Composer. And this is done with a helper plugin, which is called the Dolby Atmos Beam plugin that comes with the Composer. So let me just put a Beam plugin onto one of our tracks here. So let's put that under the drum tracks maybe. So let's search for Beam. And here we have it, the Dolby Atmos Beam plugin. Now, as soon as I add that, you will actually see that in the Dolby Atmos Composer, it has recognized the existence of the Beam plugin, and it's now expecting audio from that Beam plugin. So let's just play the audio. And because of the way everything is set up right now, I'm only going to hear the drums. Everything else is not yet routed into the Dolby Atmos Composer, so I'm not going to hear those. So let me just kind of play that. And you can essentially see that the Beam plugin is channeling the audio from the track that holds the drums loop into the Dolby Atmos Composer, into the Dolby Atmos Bed, and it's going to route that into channels 1 and 2 because currently we didn't do any panning, so it's just kind of the standard stereo that's coming in. Now, one of the things that a lot of people get confused about is that if I now want to change for example, I want to change kind of the gain of that drum loop and I want to kind of do that with the fader actually has no effect on the actual audio that is going into the Dolby Atmos Composer. Now, this is fairly obvious because what is happening is that the audio isn't even reaching the routing, the internal routing within Reaper. It is moved directly from the Beam plugin into the Dolby Atmos Composer, and that essentially means whatever I have here is actually never reaching the Dolby Atmos Composer. Now, this can be a little bit discerning simply because many of us are used to work with those faders. So what do I do? Well, there are a couple of different options that I can do, and let me just turn off the audio for a second. One I showed last week where I used buses in order to route the audio not from the original track, but actually from the bus into the Dolby Atmos Composer, and then I can essentially adjust the gain on the track that is then routed into the bus, that is then routed into the composer. Now, what I'm going to do here is the second option. I'm going to use folder tracks. So instead of putting the Beam plugin onto the track itself, I'm going to use a folder track. So let me just add an additional track here. Let's move that up maybe. And let's put the drum track into this as a folder track. And let's call that drums beam. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to, let me just delete the Dolby Atmos Beam plugin here. And let me just add one to the parent, to the folder track. Right, and I now see the drums beam plugin coming in. So the audio is not routed from the track into the composer. What it is routed from the track into the parent track, and there essentially sits the Dolby Atmos Beam plugin that it's then routing the audio into the composer. And the consequence of that is that I can now adjust the gain with the fader of the original track. So let me just see if that works. So if I'm moving the gate up and down, I can now adjust the gain in the way I'm usually adjusting the gain. So let's just do that for the remaining 3 tracks in order to get the full setup. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to simply, and let me just click those things away. Let me just add multiple tracks here, and I'm going to add 3 tracks. And those are going to be the 3 folder tracks that are going to hold the drone. Let's put that in here, the synth 1, let's put that in here, the synth 2, let's put that in here, and let's just give them the proper names. So that was the drone beam. And then we have the synth 1 beam. And then we finally have the synth 2 beam. And I should be able to type correctly, beam. And then what I'm going to do is I'm simply going to drop additional beam plugins onto those parent tracks. So I'm going to put one here. I'm going to put one to the synth 1 beam folder track. And I'm going to put one here. And as soon as I do that, let me just close all of them. We don't need them. If I'm going to open up the Dolby Atmos Composer, I now see the individual tracks here on the Dolby Atmos Composer. And if I'm playing the audio now, it should actually play just fine. Now there's one additional thing that I need to mention, and that is that at this point you might actually hear some audio dropouts or crackling sounds. This is not because your computer is not able to handle all the audio that is going into the Dolby Atmos Composer. What is actually happening is that because the Dolby Atmos Composer is bypassing the internal routing within Reaper, some of the optimization features within Reaper are conflicting with what the Dolby Atmos Composer is doing. And therefore what you need to do is you need to disable some of these optimizations. So what you need to do is you need to go into the options and preferences, and in the preferences under the buffering settings, you need to disable everything that is in the section here, FX processing, multiprocessing settings. So you need to particularly disable anticipative FX processing and also disable allow live FX multiprocessing, because those will actually conflict with the way the Dolby Atmos Composer works. And just for safe measure, it makes sense to also disable that in the rendering section. So we also go into rendering and also disable allow anticipative FX processing when rendering. That will make sure that you also don't have any issues when you're rendering later on. So at the moment, everything is a little bit boring because I'm just routing everything into the Atmos Bed, just in stereo. I haven't done any kind of panning yet, so it's not really kind of moving around the 3-dimensional space. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm simply going to change the positions of those individual sound objects in our Dolby Atmos setup. Now I could open up the Beam plugin directly from within the composer. However, if I do that, it opens up with a very small interface. So what I'm going to do instead is I'm going to just open that up here. That for some reason gives me a larger interface, not quite sure why. But so let's first kind of move the drums beam, and I'm going to, I don't know, let's just move that kind of a little bit here to the side, and then let's move that up a little. And the way to think about this panning device here is really that it is kind of, think of it that the sound are kind of moved around in a sphere. So if you're moving them closer to the listener, you're actually moving them up. Now, if you want to change the distance, you can do that with the distance knob here, but I'm just going to leave it like that. So that's fine. So they are kind of to the side, a little bit up. So the next one is the drone. So let's maybe kind of, I don't know, let's maybe move that to the back. So let's open up the drone beam and let's put that here to the back somewhere. And maybe also up a little, I don't know, maybe something like this. And then let's open up the beam that belongs to the first synth. That is sort of the clocky thing. The kind of sounds like a clock that's ticking. And let's put that here right to the sides. I think that's fine. And then the last one, that was sort of the melodic content. And let's maybe move that a little bit closer to the middle so that we also have a little bit of action in the center channel. So let's see if that changed anything. So let's play. And as you can now see, I have all kinds of information going on in the 10 channels. The only channel that's currently not really receiving anything is the LFE channel. That is channel number 4, and we're going to take care of that in a second. But let's first change some of these sources to objects. So currently everything is routed into the Dolby Atmos Bed, into a 7.1.2 bed, but we can obviously change a couple of things and kind of turn them into objects. Now, which tracks you turn into objects and which you leave in the Atmos Bed is completely up to you. There are no rules. So whatever suits you and whatever is good for your particular project, just do it that way. There are no rules, once again. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to leave the drone in the Atmos Bed and I'm going to turn everything else into an object. Now, you can do that either through the Dolby Atmos Beam plugin, so I can open up the Beam plugin and kind of then here change the pan mode from composite to objects, or the other way I could do that is by simply clicking here on the settings and just kind of turn it into an object. And what that will do is it will essentially move it will allocate the next available channels, which are channel 11 and 12, to that particular object. So it's a stereo object, so technically those are two objects, one for the left channel, one for the right channel. So let's do the same thing for the synth number 1 and the same thing for the synth number 2. Then we have these 6 objects, one again, 3 stereo pairs, and the Atmos Bed, and let's play that again. And now we essentially see the 3 objects. Now the drone is currently located behind me, and slightly above, so the main action is actually happening here on the top and the rear channels. So far so good, but we've seen that no information was reaching the LFE channel, and that is actually to some extent by design. A lot of people get confused about what the LFE channel actually is. The LFE channel, in essence, is exactly what it says it is. It is the low frequency effects channel. That is a channel that is used in movie or television audio, but it's not necessarily something that is meant to be used as a subwoofer, for example. So when we are working in music, the bus management, which essentially means kind of how much information goes to the subwoofer, is actually something that is not necessarily defined by the LFE channel. So the LFE channel is actually something different. However, there are no rules, as I said before, and we can move audio into the LFE channel, and that's what we're going to do next. Be aware, though, that because the LFE channel is technically not supposed to be used as a subwoofer channel, there are certain reproduction systems that actually ignore the LFE channel. So if you put all your low end into the LFE and you're playing it on a system that actually ignores the LFE, it actually sounds crappy. So just be aware of that. We can use it in order to augment our low end, but I actually got that question a couple of times. I would not take out all the low end from all the other channels and move it into the LFE, because then you have the possibility that on certain systems your music just doesn't sound good because there is no low end, because the LFE is ignored and there's no low end in any of the other channels. However, in our particular case, we are just going to play around with it a little, and we're going to add a little bit of low end from the kick, for example, into the LFE channel. So how do we do that? Well, first of all, let me click that away. And that's actually fairly straightforward. All we really need to do is we need to add an additional track, and I'm going to do the same thing. Let me just move that down here. And I'm going to do the same thing that I did with all the other tracks. So I'm going to actually kind of nest that in a folder track, and let's call that track LFE. And then let's call the parent track LFE Beam. And I'm going to do this very same thing. The Beam is going to hold the Beam plugin, and that will allow us to control how much information goes into the LFE channel by moving the slide or the fader of the actual LFE track itself. Now, a couple of things. First of all, let's add a Dolby Atmos Beam plugin to our parent track here. That's going to send the audio to the LFE channel. Now, in order to make that an LFE, or in order to make it recognize that this is going to be an LFE, there are two things that I'm going to do. First of all, I'm going to turn on mono. That will turn the stereo track into a mono track. So essentially, first I had two channels. Now I'm actually going to only beam one channel into the Dolby Atmos Composer. And then I'm going to tell it that it's supposed to turn that into an LFE channel. So I can select which of the channels that this beam plugin is sitting on is going to become the LFE channel. And I'm going to simply say the one, I only have one because it's a mono. So I'm going to kind of choose that one. And that's going to move that into the LFE of the Dolby Atmos Bed. And that's everything I need to set here at the beam plugin. And then I'm going to just make sure that I'm only going to send the low end. So the easiest way to do that is just by adding an EQ. And I'm going to add a Pro Q3 here, for a fab filter EQ. And let me just add a thingy here and just a low pass filter. And let's maybe do something like this. And that will essentially make sure that only low-end information is passing through, and that is going to go into the Dolby Atmos Beam plugin that will then reach the Dolby Atmos Composer. And the last thing I need to do is I need to route audio into the LFE channel, in the LFE bus technically. So let's open up the routing here, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a send, and that send is going to send everything into the LFE. And that should now move audio from the... Actually, that is incorrect. Let's get that. What I actually want is I want the original drum track to send audio in there. So let me just open that up again, and here we are. And we're going to add a send into the LFE. And that's now going to send audio from the original track into the LFE, and that is going to then kind of only bypass allow the low ends to pass through, and that is going to go into the Dolby Atmos Composer. So let me just listen on how that sounds. And for that, I'm probably going to open up the Dolby Atmos Composer here. And I should now see information coming in at channel number 4. That is the LFE channel. So let's just play audio. And I actually see that coming in here. That might be a bit much. So what I can do is I can simply reduce the amount of audio that I want to send into the LFE. That is now going to send that. Now, what I can do is I can mute some of the channels here in the Digital Audio Composer. So if I, for example, only want to hear what's going to go into the Atmos Bed, what I need to do is I need to mute the objects. So let's just mute the objects here. And then now I essentially have everything that's going into the Dolby Atmos Bed. And you can hear it's very faint. Let me just turn that up again. Yeah, so that sounds like red. And that sounds pretty good. So the next thing I want to do is I want to add a little bit of reverb. And the reverb I want to add is an immersive reverb. So I don't really want to add reverbs to the individual objects themselves, because if I do that, then the reverb would be positioned or would be located at the same position of the object. What I really want is that the reverb fills out the entire space. So what I need to do is I need to add the reverb to the Atmos Bed. And the way I'm going to do that is pretty much in exactly the same way I worked with the LFE. I'm going to add an additional track that is going to hold the reverb, and that's going to be a 7.1.2 track, and that is then going to be routed into the Dolby Atmos Bed. So let's do that. So let's once again kind of click that Dolby Atmos Composer away, and what I'm going to do here is I'm going to add a new track and do the same thing again. Let's add one more. And I'm going to once again kind of put that into a folder. So once again, if you don't like that folder structure here, what you can also do is you can simply use buses, and then you can sort of group those buses, and kind of that makes it look a little nicer. But because we only had 4 tracks here, I think that's perfectly fine to do it that way. So a couple of things. Well, first of all, I'd like to have a full immersive reverb that uses all channels in the Dolby Atmos Bed. That essentially means that I need 10 channels. So let's turn those into 10 channel tracks. And I'm going to choose 10 here, and then the same thing with the parent track. Okay. And then I'm going to add a reverb here. And the reverb that I'm going to use is cinematic room. So essentially you can use any surround sound reverb that can produce 7.1.2 reverb. I personally like cinematic rooms, but kind of there are many options that you have, and I'm pretty sure that there's also a Reaper internal option. But once again, cinematic rooms is a very popular one. Now I'm not going to change too much because I'm just using that for demonstration purposes, so I'm not going to work with the reverb itself. I just let it kind of do its thing. The only thing I want to make sure is that I'm only going to get the wet signal, and that is what it is doing right now. And the other thing that I will need to do is I need to once again add a Dolby Atmos Beam plugin to the parent track. So let's add a Beam plugin here and add that. And I sort of see that as a 7.1.2 because it is thinking of this as a Atmos Bed that I'm going to, a signal that I'm going to send into the Dolby Atmos Bed. So it kind of identifies it as 7.1.2. And then let's just double check the Dolby Atmos Composer. And in the Composer, I now see that particular track. I didn't give it a name, so let's just kind of name that. So let's call that track Reverb. And let's call that Reverb Beam. Now, if I do it like that, I'm pretty sure that oops, that was wrong, sorry, Dolby Atmos Composer here. Yeah, so now it's sort of the reverb beam. And that should now kind of send the reverb into the Dolby Atmos Bed. Now, the last thing I need to do is I need to route audio into the reverb bus. And for this example, I'm just going to use one of those tracks, and I'm just going to route audio from the synth 2 that was the melodic part of that particular sample pack. And let's just kind of route that. So let's go into the routing options. And in the routing options, I'm going to add this additional send. I'm going to send that into the reverb. And that will now kind of send audio in addition to kind of as an object into the Dolby Atmos Composer. It will also send it into the reverb track. The reverb track then is also going to go into a Beam plugin. The Beam plugin is going to go into the Dolby Atmos Composer. Let's just open that up here. Let's just play our audio and see how that sounds now. So once again, I can mute the objects, and that sort of gives me the reverb only. So everything that's in the Dolby Atmos Bed. So the reverb is maybe a little, let's bring that down a little. So that sounds pretty okay. So I now have the LFE channel, the reverb, and then the drone that was already in the bed. So that essentially makes up the Dolby Atmos Bed. And if I mute the composite or the bed, so once again, composite is Fiedler speak for the Dolby Atmos Bed. These are the three objects. And all together, and that sounds pretty nice. So once I've completed all my setup, the next thing I want to do is I want to export that as a Dolby Atmos Masterfile that I can then upload to a streaming service. So how do I do that, given that Reaper can't really export Dolby Atmos? Well, the answer to that is the export happens through the Dolby Atmos Composer plugin. So let's see how that actually works. Now, there are a couple of things that I need to do. First of all, I need to prepare the export, and there are two things that I need to set. First of all, I need to go into the options, and in the options, I need to tell the system what exactly I want to export. Do I want to export the ADM BWF file, that is the Dolby Atmos Masterfile here, or do I want to export a mixdown, a re-render or a render of the actual speaker output, which can be up to essentially 9.1.6 depending on what speaker output I choose, or do I want to render the headphone output? I can do that, and I can render everything at once. So now in my particular case, I'm really only interested in the Dolby Atmos Masterfile, so I'm going to just say yes here and let everything to be off. And then I need to kind of change or I need to prepare the in points and the out points of the export settings. What do these in points and out points mean? Well, the way this works is that the Dolby Atmos Composer needs to know where the audio starts and where the audio ends. And that is done by kind of giving it the in points and out points. Now the in point, you can leave that at 0. Actually, in preparing this video, I ran into some issues if that was not 0. So just for the purpose of being safe, leave that at 0 if at all possible. And then essentially we need to send the out point. That means that we need to set or we need to tell the Dolby Atmos Composer where the audio ends. So what I'm going to do is I'm simply going to kind of move the marker here and then simply say set out point, and that puts it to 35 seconds and something. And then essentially I'm ready in the Dolby Atmos Composer, and I can press the export button. This will sort of record enable the Dolby Atmos Composer. I now need to tell the system what file I want to write this to. So let's call that Atmos test, and let's drop that on the desktop. That's fine. And it's now waiting for me to do something. I can now either play the file and then it's going to just export it as I'm playing it, or I can also use the offline render mode. And so let's kind of do that. So all I really need to do is to go into the render settings. And there are really only two things I need to kind of pay attention to. The first thing is I need to make sure that the sample rate is set to 48 kilohertz, and that is because Dolby Atmos requires 48 kilohertz. If you don't set it up that way, it will actually give you an error. So just make sure that you have set it to 48 kilohertz. And the second thing that I need to be aware of is that what is now happening is that Reaper is going to export and the Dolby Atmos Composer is going to export. And the export that is coming out of the Dolby Atmos Composer might actually take a bit. So if you are now rendering that file, be aware that this is not kind of happening as fast as you are used to. It's actually going to take a little bit of time until everything is rendered. In addition to that, because I'm talking about a file that has 128 channels, these files can actually be quite large. I have had a couple of people reach out to me that, kind of my Atmos Masterfile is so large. Is this the way it's supposed to be? And yes, it is. That is because it is just 128 channels with additional information about the positional data of the individual object. So it can be quite large. But so with that being said, let's just kind of press the render button. Now I'm probably going to kind of speed that up or kind of zoom out and zoom back in once I'm done, because I think it's going to take about 2 minutes until this is rendered. But once again, let's just press render, and this should start the rendering. So I see that sort of the composer is doing something, and let's wait and see what happens. Okay, so we are close to being done, and now essentially I have it finished. I have the typical output that Reaper produces, and then I also kind of got the information from the Dolby Atmos Composer that the export was successful. Now, one thing to be aware of is that the WAV file that has been created through the Dolby Atmos Composer is something that you cannot simply play on a traditional media player, because it is a Dolby Atmos Masterfile. It looks like a WAV file, and it does play something, but it's not going to play correctly. It's only going to play the first 2 channels, but in reality, these are 128 channels with some additional metadata. So most players are not able to really reproduce that correctly. So in order to check if the master file that I've just produced is actually a correct one, what I can do is I can go to the import button here that is under options. And what it allows me to do is it allows me to load up a Dolby Atmos Masterfile. Now the Dolby Atmos Masterfile that I've created is this Atmos test. So let's load that up. And as soon as I've loaded that up, the Dolby Atmos Composer is turned into a player, and I can now play that file and see or hear if everything is exported correctly. And that sounds pretty nice. Now, if I want to go back to the original setting, I just say unload, and I'm now back into the original mode of the Dolby Atmos Composer. So the Dolby Atmos Composer also doubles as a media player for master files, which is actually really nice, because if you're working with Dolby Atmos, this is, especially on Windows, this is actually something that you generally can't really do, because most players are not able to kind of play Dolby Atmos master files correctly. Another way to test your master file is to run it through the Dolby Atmos renderer. The renderer itself exists for Windows. You just can't use it in a production environment. You can use it in order to play master files or to re-render master files or to render quality control deliverables, but you can't really use it in connection with a digital audio workstation, unfortunately, but we can at least test our master file. So let's do that. Now, I've already opened up the Dolby Atmos Composer here, and I've loaded in the Atmos test master file. That was the one that we just created. In case you want to know how to do that, you just go to the file section here and you open master file, and that loads it up. And let's just play it and see how that actually sounds. And it sounds exactly the way it's supposed to. So So this is really everything I wanted to say today. Once again, the combination between Reaper and the Dolby Atmos Composer from Fiedler Audio is a really interesting one in my opinion. It allows you to stay completely within the box. You don't have to do any complicated routing to an external application, none of that. You just stay within Reaper, everything happens within Reaper. The export is just a regular Reaper export, and you produce Dolby Atmos Masterfiles that way that you can then upload to streaming services, which is really, really cool. Now, I'm probably going to do a couple of follow-up videos here because there are a couple of things I would like to talk about that I didn't have time today, but this is going to come over the next couple of weeks. Until then, if you have any questions or comments, please use the comment section below or join my Discord community. Invite link is in the description below. And with that being said, see you at the next video.